Amnesia Rebirth is the third game in the Amnesia series. These games all have their own stories, meaning that you don't need to know anything about the other ones when playing any of them. The first Amnesia game was very successful, although I must admit that I did not really like it much. The same can be said about the second one. There was one more called Soma. If you watched any of my other videos, you might have heard me mention it. It's a game with minimal gameplay but a fantastic story and an excellent presentation. Definitely my favorite game released by this developer, and also the one that precedes Amnesia Rebirth. With that in mind, you can probably see how I had high hopes for this latest game, hoping that it will be more like Soma than the previous Amnesia games. But first, let's mention that Rebirth has full support for ultrawide and super ultrawide resolutions. No need for any fixes, just set your 21:9 or 32:9 resolution from the menu and start playing. And now let's move on to the actual game review. I will be discussing the story and gameplay together since they are very much intertwined. We control Tassi Trianon. At the beginning of the game there isn't much we know about her, besides the fact that she's French, and we can base that on her accent. As the game's title implies, Tassi is an amnesiac and can only remember that she had just survived a plane crash. A short time later, she also recalls being pregnant and having a husband, which prompts her to look for him. This is the main story, at least at the beginning, but there is another one which the game tells us within its loading screens. It illustrates our protagonist's past and the hardships she had to endure back then. I found this approach to storytelling to be quite interesting at first. However, as the game progressed, I became more and more annoyed by it, because the gameplay would occasionally be interrupted by flashbacks. These memory segments were very boring, especially due to the fact that the developer decided to make it easy on themselves and simply give us some poorly drawn images instead of a proper cutscene. Mind you, the game is barely more than a walking simulator anyway. We walk around on mostly linear maps, find items, use them in specific places, and then progress to the next step. In addition to that, we have to constantly look for hidden matchboxes and fuel cans. The cans are used to refuel our lantern, however filling it up only provides light for about a minute, after which you have to repeat the whole process again. It's extremely annoying and feels like busy work. We do have a sanity system where traveling in the dark can cause us to go mad, which is the game's version of dying, by the way. This is also the reason why we have to constantly look for sources of light, otherwise it's game over for Tassi. And speaking of death, this game has an interesting mechanic, which you can see here. We don't really ever die. Our character just goes mad and we see these scenes of her running around and having visions. Usually we get to wake up really close to the place of our death, and the scenes that play out are interesting to look at. My main problem with this is that you might die a few times in a row and the whole cutscene of Tassi going crazy and walking around simply takes too long. There's no way to skip it either. I remember one time thinking to myself, just let me play already. It gets old fast, but luckily the game is not really difficult and death is a rare occurrence. I've mentioned that Tassi has amnesia, and one of the best ways for her to restore her memories is by reading the many documents which are scattered all over the place. To me personally, this is very annoying because I just don't like standing there and reading when I want to play a game. Very few of these notes are actually voice acted. Not to mention that most of the files you find seem to not even be related directly to the story. This gets complicated fast since Tassi has an amulet which allows her to see ripples between worlds. Soon after the game starts, we will use it and end up in a foreign place which was once inhabited by an advanced race but is now roamed by monsters. I can't tell you more because I don't want to spoil the story, but I can say that the game will mostly keep its secrets until the third act, when the plot will actually begin to unravel. The problem is that before that time you will mostly be dealing with the story around Tassi's expedition and how her crew got separated. This part of the narrative is convoluted, boring, and presented poorly. The game throws a bunch of names at you without showing you most of these characters and expects you to remember them. It doesn't help that all of them sound boring from what you've read about them. Visually, the game looks fantastic. Since the developer has a bigger budget now, we actually get to see the monsters rather than having our screen completely distorted whenever they appear as it was in the previous games. I appreciate that, and while they are mostly humanoids, I was still feeling threatened by them for the first portion of the game. You will, however, quickly realize that the game relies too much on scripted events, making the monsters seem more like decorative pieces from that moment on, rather than a menace which won't leave you in peace. Since our protagonist is mostly helpless, we are instructed to sneak around and avoid all conflict, which works well enough, but I soon came to the conclusion that sneaking is boring and slow and just decided to wing it by running past the monsters. This approach is probably the reason why I died a few more times than necessary, but at least added some excitement to the gameplay. There are actual moments when the game wants you to simply run for your life. Look at this scene. What really bothered me here was that Tassie actually tells the player to run. This breaking of the fourth wall was completely unnecessary and actually annoyed me. The devs should have had enough confidence in their own presentation to know that the player will understand what is wanted of them. Make no mistake, Tassie is not really talking to herself when screaming run. This request is directed at the player. She actually says it more than once during the chase scene, but I don't want to play it for too long since I have more ground to cover and would hate for this video to end up being way too long. Another thing I have to mention is that the overall gameplay feels like it hasn't evolved yet. You still have to hold the left click while moving the mouse in order to open doors, drag items, and other actions. It's really annoying and feels especially clunky and out of place when you have to do it during one of those running segments, since it is kind of slow. I did mention our sanity earlier. If it drops too much, we get a chance to fix it by making Tassie stroke her stomach and talk to her unborn child. The whole idea of playing a pregnant woman sounds strange on paper, but our protagonist ends up being a very strong and resilient female. The idea of her child giving her strength and inner peace is actually quite good. It serves as a reasonable explanation as to why our character is handling all this extremely scary stuff without breaking down mentally. This is where I would like to mention the excellent voice acting. While most of it will come from Tassie herself, we do get to interact with a few other characters, and they too are voice acted perfectly. Something that you will notice quickly is the fact that the game has the habit of pulling the rug from under your feet way too often. What I mean by that is that the game will present you with an obstacle which is blocking your progress. You will now have to find a solution, which usually consists of multiple steps, and just as you're about to deal with the problem, something unexpected happens and you now have a whole new situation to deal with. This would not be so bad if the game didn't do it over and over again. After a while, I was literally wondering what the game will think of next in order to slow me down and complicate things more. It feels like a reverse Deus Ex Machina, where instead of helping the hero of our story, the game is conjuring things out of its figurative ass in order to slow us down. And don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware of the fact that all games do this to some extent. The problem with Amnesia Rebirth is that it really goes overboard with it. In addition to that, the story suffers from the fact that many issues remain unsolved. As the player, I was left wondering why Tassie has amnesia in the first place. She wasn't injured too seriously from the plane crash, you even get a chance to look at her reflection a few times and can tell that she's mostly fine. None of the other people from the plane crash seem to have amnesia, and there are a few more questions which I will keep to myself since I don't want to risk spoiling anything. But trust me, the game doesn't explain a few important plot points, and that ended up bothering me a lot. At the end of the day, Amnesia Rebirth is not the game I was hoping it would be. I still enjoyed playing it. The first and second act were slow and boring at first, but it definitely saved the best for last. And when it comes to the Amnesia trilogy for me, this one is still the best out of them if we don't count the vastly superior Soma. Tassie Rhiannon is a good protagonist, and the idea of her pregnancy added an interesting element to both the gameplay and story of Rebirth. However, the way you move and interact with the environment needs to change. I know Frictional Games considers this to be something of a personal touch that they like to leave on all of their titles, but it really doesn't feel good when playing and having to deal with it. Honestly, it's just a pain in the ass. As for the horror in the game, I have to say that Rebirth manages to be scary even when you realize that most enemies are just scripted and rarely pose a threat. It does a few tricks along the way, which definitely surprised me and managed to invoke dread. Jump scares are almost never utilized, and the game relies mostly on its environment and sound in order to induce fear in the heart of the player. Personally, I find that this approach is the most effective one. The game managed to sometimes place me in a state of impending doom where nothing scary seems to be happening, but I feel like it's about to and am therefore on edge. While I ended up enjoying this game, I do fear that people who really loved the first Amnesia will end up being disappointed with this one, because while it is somewhat similar to it, it also feels very different. If, however, you are simply a fan of horror games in general, I believe that Amnesia Rebirth will definitely scratch that itch for you. The game took me a bit over 9 hours to beat and only costs €25 on both Steam and GOG.com. If you are interested in it, I urge you to consider getting it on GOG since the games there come without any DRM, which is something I advocate for. I'm not sponsored or affiliated to them in any way, and this is simply my personal opinion. With that having been said, I would like to thank you for watching Game Filter and hope to see you next time. Until then, have a great day.